Okay, let's unpack this. We all have this fundamental human drive, right? To connect with people, understand each other.
Yeah, it's just built air.
But it feels, I don't know, particularly complex right now.
Hmm.
Trying to do that in a world that's just flooded with information, digital stuff everywhere.
It absolutely does. It's like the ground rules for connecting are kind of shifting under our feet, maybe not so subtly even.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive. We've got this, well, this fascinating stack of sources you've pulled together.
Yeah, tried to get a good mix.
And it is.
Yeah.
We're looking at reflections on that popular book about knowing others.
David Brooks, yeah.
Right. And some really striking research summaries on social trends, psychological stuff happening right now.
Plus articles digging into tech's impact and even like raw reactions from people online grappling with it all.
It gives us this really needed sort of layered view, doesn't it? Big picture trends, the tech angle, and then the person-to-person stuff. So our mission for this deep dive is to navigate through all of it. We want to try and cut through the noise, get a clear, well-informed perspective on what these sources say is happening to our ability to connect.
And what skills might actually be needed now to, really know someone.
Yes. And crucially, how technologies, especially social media, fits into this whole picture, for better or worse, right?
Right. And the goal, as always, is pull out the key insights, maybe the tensions, the surprising bits.
All distilled and presented directly for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Because you're navigating these exact questions about connection in your own life, like every single day. So, ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So our sources suggest, starting with this concept, some are calling it the empathy paradox.
Okay.
Here's the basic tension. We are arguably more connected technologically than ever before, constantly linked up devices, platforms.
Totally. Nonstop.
Yet at the same time, there's some pretty compelling evidence suggesting we might actually be experiencing increasing social disconnection on a deeper level.
That just feels weirdly contradictory, doesn't it? How can you be like digitally joined at the hip with the whole world, but feel less connected to actual people?
It feels that way, yeah. But the research Sarah Conrath summarizes gives us some, pretty stark data points. They point to societal shifts that might help explain this paradox.
Okay.
She looked at something called cross-temporal meta-analyses. Basically, think of it as taking results from the same standardized psych tests given to different groups of young Americans, mostly college students, over many, many years.
Like from the late 70s up to the 2010s.
Exactly. So it lets you see how average personality traits might be changing, over time in the population.
Right, looking for trends in how people think and feel about themselves, about others,
Yeah.
generationally. What did she find?
Well, she found a significant rise in what you could call self-oriented traits.
Okay.
For instance, self-esteem has gone up. Now, a healthy level of self-esteem is generally good.
No way.
But the sources point out that very high self-esteem, it can actually be problematic if it's not grounded or if it lacks consideration for others.
Makes sense. What else?
Individualism also rose significantly. Younger generations were much more likely to endorse traits like independent, individualistic, leadership ability, seeing those as important or descriptive of themselves.
So more focus inward on the self.
Precisely. And maybe the most striking finding, a significant rise in narcissism.
Really?
Yeah. College students in later decades were much more likely to agree with statements like, I always know what I'm doing, or if I ruled the world, it would be a better place.
Wow.
And this one's particularly telling. I will never be satisfied until I get all that I deserve.
If I ruled the world. That's definitely painting a picture of high self-regard.
It is. Conrath summary notes, get this, the average narcissism score for college students back in 2006. Yeah. It was as high as the scores you'd typically see from celebrities just before an interview.
No way. That high.
That high. And this trend, it's not just like interesting trivia. The sources point out it has potentially serious consequences for relationships, for society.
How so?
Well, think difficulty being a good relationship partner, being highly reactive to criticism or perceived threats, maybe being more prone to exploiting others.
Okay, so the me seems to be getting stronger, louder, maybe. What about the we, the social side?
This is where we see some, concerning trends. There's been a significant decline in what's called dispositional empathy.
Dispositional empathy, meaning like your general tendency to be empathetic.
Exactly, your capacity for it. It includes two main parts. Effective empathic concern, that's feeling concern or compassion for others.
Being with them.
Right. And cognitive perspective taking. That's the ability to understand someone else's viewpoint, their mental state, sometimes called theory of mind.
Got it. Understanding where they're coming from.
Exactly. And the data from these meta-analyses, it showed about a 40% decline on average among college students between 1979 and 2009.
Hold on. 40%.
Watch it.
That's not subtle. That's a massive drop in basically one generation.
It's a huge change. And while the trend maybe started a bit earlier, the sources indicate the steepest decline in empathy really began around the year 2000.
Around 2000, okay.
And this pattern holds up across different groups: gender, ethnicity, educational background. It seems those born in the 1980s and later consistently report the lowest levels of empathy in these studies.
And you mentioned something about attachment styles, too. How does that fit?
Yes. Alongside that empathy decline, there's been a rise in what researchers call dismissing attachment styles.
Dismissing attachment. What does that look like?
People with this style, they tend to have positive views of themselves, but kind of negative views of others. They often feel comfortable without close relationships and can actually struggle to form or maintain them.
Interesting.
And this increase in dismissing attachment also began, guess when, late 1990s, running parallel to the empathy decline.
Wow.
And maybe unsurprisingly, dismissing attachment is linked to high narcissism and low empathy. The pieces seem to fit together.
It definitely feels like these trends are all connected somehow, painting a consistent, if maybe a little worrying, picture.
These seem to be. Other findings mentioned in the sources include things like shifts in moral reasoning becoming more self-centered justifications and declines in community participation. You know, Robert Putnam's work on Bowling Alone,
Oh, yeah, classic.
showing less involvement in clubs, social gatherings, even just casual interactions. And that's linked to loss of trust, less civic engagement.
Okay, let's step back from the data for a second. Why does this overall trend, rising self-focus, declining empathy, maybe less community connection, why does this really matter to us, to you listening?
Well, because at the most basic level, social connection, belonging, they aren't just nice-to-haves. The sources really emphasize their fundamental human needs, like essential for our individual well-being.
Yeah.
People who are well-connected tend to live longer, have better physical health. Social interaction releases bonding hormones, helps regulate stress. It's deep stuff.
So it's literally tied to our health,
Yeah.
our longevity.
Right. And then on a societal level, these trends could have pretty significant consequences. Conrath uses this provocative example.
Okay.
If widespread egotism continues unchecked, you could potentially see institutions that rely on a sense of collective well-being. Think public education funding, nonprofits really struggling, if people become less willing to contribute without seeing a direct personal benefit.
Huh. That's a sobering thought.
It's maybe an extreme, but the trends suggest a real challenge to the social fabric. It's a powerful idea. A decline in individual empathy could actually pose a risk to our collective institutions.
That really connects the dots.
Well,
Okay, so let's pivot to one major factor the sources highlight as potentially contributing to these shifts. The changing media landscape.
yeah, the sheer scale of the increase in media consumption is just astonishing. If you go back to the 1930s, people might consume, maybe 10 hours of media a week? Mostly movies, radio, records.
Right.
Fast forward to the 2000s, and we're talking nearly 11 hours a day.
11 hours a day.
I swear.
That's almost like a second job just consuming media. We're
Yeah.
absolutely saturated.
Totally. TV, video games, computers, internet, smartphones, tablets, the whole shebang. And it's worth noting some of the trends we discussed, like that decline in community participation Putnam talked about, that actually started before the internet was really widespread,
Oh, interesting.
which suggests that maybe earlier forms of media, like TV, might have already been playing a role. The sources even mention that 1976 movie Network.
Yeah.
It satirized this kind of societal disconnection. There's a quote about someone being television incarnate, indifferent to suffering, insensitive to joy. Pretty cutting.
Wow. So these concerns about media's impact, they're not new at all.
Not at all. But the rise of new social media platforms, the explosion blogger, MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, starting late 90s, early 2000s. That period coincides quite directly with that sharpest decline in empathy and the rise in dismissing attachment styles we saw in the data.
Ah, okay. So while media's impact has been debated for ages, the timing of these specific psychological shifts, looks very, very connected to the rise of social networking.
It's a really significant correlation, yeah. And social media now makes up a huge chunk of our online time, like nearly a quarter of it.
Okay, so how exactly might these new social media platforms be contributing to this potential disconnection? The sources lay out several theoretical reasons.
They do. One of the big ones cited frequently is the loss of nonverbal cues.
Right, like facial expressions, tone of voice.
Exactly. Experts like Sherry Turkle are mentioned, noting that a huge percentage of our communication, maybe up to 90%, is nonverbal. Digital channels, especially just text, strip most of that away.
Which makes it way harder to accurately read someone's emotional state or their real intent.
Much harder. And the sources argue that empathy develops partly from practicing these skills in rich, multi-sensory environments, face-to-face.
Makes total sense. You can't really read the room when the room is just a comment section online.
Exactly. Another potential factor is anonymity and de-individuation.
Meaning.
That feeling of being anonymous online, sometimes it can loosen inhibitions. People might behave in ways they wouldn't face-to-face. It can make it easier to be harsh or dismissive or just ignore the feelings of someone who feels kind of distant or abstract on a screen.
Like online trolling behavior, basically.
Classic example. Then there's something called compassion fatigue.
Okay.
Just the constant, unfiltered stream of news, global suffering, disasters, conflict. It can just be overwhelming and potentially lead to emotional numbing over time. You just can't take it all in.
It's just too much to process, so maybe you start to shut down a bit defensively.
Potentially, yeah. Filter bubbles are also highlighted. You know how algorithms personalize our feeds?
Based on what we click on.
Right. So this can, as Eli Pariseau described it, create a universe of the self. It constantly reinforces our existing views, limits our exposure to genuinely different perspectives or opinions.
Which makes understanding someone with a totally different background or belief system really, really difficult. We just keep getting shown more of what we already think.
Right. Creates echo chambers. And then finally, there's just the simple reality of time and energy.
Meaning?
Time spent heavily engaged online is often time not spent in rich in-person interaction, so maybe social skills get a bit rusty.
Yeah.
Plus, excessive screen time is linked in some studies to increased anxiety, depression, and it can just erode face-to-face interactions generally.
And the spread of misinformation is another piece of this puzzle mentioned too, right? How easily false stuff can go viral.
Yeah, without verification, impacting public discourse, health decisions, politics. It's a big one. All these mechanisms, the sources present them as ways the structure and nature of new social media could be actively working against developing and practicing empathy and deep connection.
This makes that whole conversation about how to connect feel even more urgent. Which I guess brings us neatly to David Brooks and his book, How to Know a Person.
Right.
According to the source summaries, Brooks basically argues that knowing others, it isn't just something that happens naturally, it actually takes intentional effort, specific skills.
And skills he believes anyone can learn to sort of counteract some of those natural human tendencies towards self-focus we talked about.
Okay, so what are his key strategies?
Well, the first one really centers on making people feel seen and valued.
Okay.
Interacting in ways that genuinely show appreciation for who they are and a sincere desire to understand them.
So it's more than just hearing the words they say. It's signaling you're really receiving them as a person.
Exactly. This involves being open to their ideas, their experiences, practicing what he calls generous listening, being truly present, even during just, mundane stuff.
Yeah.
And using conversational skills effectively, even recognizing small talk as a chance to connect. The sources mention, interestingly, that while Brooks offers specific techniques, some communication experts might favor slightly different phrasing.
Like what?
Like maybe affect labeling, explicitly naming the emotion you observe over using I statements all the time, but the core idea is the same. Validate the other person.
Affect labeling.
Yeah.
So instead of, I feel like you're upset, maybe more like, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated right now.
Precisely. Putting a name, tentatively, to the likely emotion you're observing in them. Okay, the second strategy from Brooks. Engaging deeply with people's life stories.
Getting beyond just the surface facts about them.
Absolutely. So instead of just asking what someone thinks about something, ask how they came to think that way.
Digging deeper.
Yeah. Understand their background, their personal history, their temperament, what their priorities are, their hot buttons. It's about being genuinely curious, looking beneath that surface-level presentation. And the sources also note the importance of considering cultural influences here. Recognizing, for example, how growing up in a more individualist culture versus a more collectivist, one can shape how someone sees themselves, how they communicate.
So understanding the whole iceberg, not just the tiny tip sticking out.
Well put, yeah. And Brooks's third main strategy involves actively practicing difficult social and emotional skills.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means consciously working against some of those natural human tendencies we discussed earlier, like self-centeredness, impatience, or maybe the desire to avoid the messy parts of other people's lives.
This sounds like it connects directly back to empathy again.
It really does.
Yeah.
Practicing both cognitive empathy, understanding their mental state, and emotional empathy, feeling with them, that's fundamental to Brooks's whole approach. A Psychology Today source actually highlights that empathy is, a natural capacity. We're kind of brainwired for it. Rick Hansen is quoted describing empathy almost as a form of mindfulness, like consciously sustaining your attention on another person's inner world. He notes it's soothing, calming, it builds bridges.
And he had that interesting point that a little bit of detachment can actually help it.
Yeah, that maybe stepping back just slightly allows for a clearer perspective sometimes. The source also offers this really simple, powerful thought. The best way to get empathy is often just to give it. And the example Brooks uses of Renee Mitchell, that journalist in Portland, it embodies this idea. Her whole approach was about building strength in others, making people feel genuinely seen through her work.
So Brooks is essentially offering a set of practical skills: listen better, ask better questions, work against your own ego as a pathway to deeper connection.
That's the core idea, yeah. And it's a compelling one, especially when you think about those trends towards disconnection we talked about earlier.
It's also important to look at the critiques, right? The alternative views presented in some of the sources. Not everyone was fully on board with Brooks's approach.
Definitely not. We saw some of those reactions you mentioned earlier, particularly in that online community discussion.
Yes, some Reddit users felt it came across as a bit like mansplaining, or found some anecdotes maybe a bit self-focused, or felt he was just kind of rephrasing familiar concepts, buzzwords maybe. There was also some skepticism about his perspective coming from being an op-ed journalist versus someone deeply involved in personal counseling or something similar.
Those are definitely points raised in the sources, yeah.
And the short-form summary also presents critiques. It raises a concern that his perspective, largely as a cultural critic, might not fully capture or appreciate the huge diversity of individual experiences out there.
Okay.
And some critics argue that his writing style itself, which sometimes involves categorizing types of people, making generalizations, might inadvertently hinder genuine understanding of human complexity, rather than help it.
Because real people are messy and nuanced, not easily put into boxes. Exactly. And some sources push back specifically against his broader societal commentary. They argue he might overlook genuine progress, structural factors like advancements in civil rights, evolving moral codes.
By focusing too much on a perceived decline in individual character.
Right. The critique even points to linguistic data, apparently showing an increase in the use of moral terms in English since 2000, which directly contradicts a claim Brooks makes about moral decline.
Huh. That's a specific factual challenge, based on other research then. So, while the goal knowing others better is something most people want, the methods and the broader framing Brooks uses, they don't land perfectly for everyone, and they face some data-driven counterpoints.
It really just highlights how complicated this whole issue of understanding people, understanding society really is. Now, while we've definitely explored how social media might contribute to disconnection, it's equally important to acknowledge, as the sources do, that it also offers some pretty significant ways to increase connection. It's definitely not just a simple villain in this story.
All right, the picture is way more complex.
Yeah.
What are some of those positive aspects that came up?
Well, one of the most obvious, powerful benefits is connecting across vast distances. Social media makes global connectivity possible. It transcends geography.
Totally.
It lets people easily keep in touch with friends, family, colleagues they might otherwise just completely lose contact with over time.
That's huge, especially for families spread out all over, or people who move for work.
Absolutely. It also provides pretty unparalleled access to information and exposure to diverse groups, diverse ideas that you might just never encounter in your local physical bubble.
Yeah.
And it gives average individuals a voice, right?
Yeah.
A platform they might not have had before. It enables people to become content creators, advocates for social issues, causes they care about.
It definitely democratizes communication in a way that just wasn't possible before.
And it's apparently particularly good at leveraging what sociologist Mark Granovetter called the strength of weak ties.
Weak ties, meaning like acquaintances, not your closest friends.
Yeah, exactly. Not your inner circle, but the broader network. Social media excels at maintaining and activating these weaker ties, and these can be crucial bridges for spreading information, organizing grassroots movement,
Oh, interesting.
or even facilitating small-scale pro-social acts. Conrad had those anecdotes about using social media to organize a breast cancer walk or find a potential kidney donor for someone, things like that.
So even if it's not always deep, intimate connection, it's incredibly effective for coordination, for sharing info, for broader social action.
Yes, and it can absolutely enable connection around shared interests or identities, creating communities where people feel understood, supported, even if they've never met face-to-face.
Mm-hmm.
The Wikipedia example is interesting, too. It shows how people can collaborate massively, feel connected to a common goal, a project, even without needing deep emotional bonds with every single collaborator.
So it offers different types of connection, maybe, and facilitates large-scale coordination that was just much harder before.
And this brings us right back to the nuance, the complexity that the sources really emphasize, particularly when it comes to the limitations of the current research.
Okay, how so?
Well, much of the research linking social media used to traits like narcissism or lower empathy, it's what's called correlational.
Meaning it shows two things tend to happen together, but doesn't prove one causes the other.
Exactly. Just because A shows up when B shows up doesn't mean A caused B. It could be B caused A, or maybe more likely some third thing, factor C, is influencing both A and B.
Right.
So, for example, does using social media cause narcissism, or are people who are already more narcissistic just drawn to platforms that let them self-promote?
Or is there something else entirely, like socioeconomic background or parenting, that makes someone both more narcissistic and more likely to use social media a certain way?
Exactly. It's the classic chicken and egg problem, or maybe, like you said, a third chicken problem we haven't even identified yet. There's a real lack of robust experimental studies or long-term longitudinal studies that follow people over time, which could help tease out cause and effect better.
So we need more nuanced research.
Definitely. Asking really specific questions. Which types of media use, in which contexts, for whom and why, lead to which specific outcomes. We need to get way more granular.
We need to move beyond just social media, good or bad.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember, media isn't the only factor influencing these complex psychological and social traits like empathy or individualism.
Good point.
The sources point to other potential influences too, like changes in family size. Smaller families might mean fewer siblings, so less early practice in negotiation, perspective taking, or shifts in educational approaches. Like the whole self-esteem movement may be prioritizing feeling good over getting constructive feedback sometimes.
There's this really complex web of societal changes happening, not just the screens we're all looking at.
Exactly. And the philosopher Neil Postman is quoted with this powerful observation that technology always introduces trade-offs.
How so?
Well, Freud's point about the telephone is a classic example. It lets you connect across huge distances, which is amazing, right? Again.
Yeah.
But by making remote communication so easy, maybe it also subtly encourages more physical separation. New tech gives us something, but often something else shifts or is diminished in the process.
That's a really interesting way to frame it, a trade-off.
And the sources raise this other fascinating idea.
Yeah.
Maybe new social media isn't just impacting connection as we knew it. Maybe it's fundamentally changing the very definition of social connection itself.
Whoa.
Maybe those weak ties, maybe online-only interactions. Maybe that's becoming the dominant form of connection for some people, or in some contexts, the concept itself might be evolving along with the tech.
That's a really provocative thought.
No.
That the thing itself is changing.
It is.
Okay, so let's try and bring all of this together then. We've got David Brooks offering these practical, intentional skills, listening, asking deeper questions, working against our own self-focus as a way to really know others.
Right. How does this resonate in our current digital age, which, as we've seen from all these sources, is characterized by both incredible opportunities for connection and some significant potential roadblocks like losing nonverbal cues, filter bubbles, just the sheer volume of it all?
It really raises that central question that comes out of the sources. Does this digital age make the kind of intentional, skill-based approach Brooks suggests more necessary? Precisely because genuine connection requires overcoming these new technological barriers and distractions. Or does the very nature of digital interaction make practicing skills like deep listening, which traditionally relies so heavily on nonverbal cues, inherently harder to do well?
It almost feels like the answer could be yes to both, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That it requires more intentional skill because a digital environment presents all these new challenges to the old ways of connecting.
That tension definitely emerges powerfully when you synthesize these different perspectives. Okay, so to kind of recap this whole deep dive, we've seen that while our need to connect is deeply human, modern life, modern technology, they present some really complex challenges, but also opportunities. Research points to some concerning large-scale societal shifts, lower empathy, higher self-focus, although the exact causal link with technology is clearly still being figured out, and it's definitely nuanced.
Very nuanced.
And authors like David Brooks are pushing us to think about connection not just as something passive that happens, but as an active skill, something to be learned and practiced, even if his specific approach, faces some valid critiques.
Yeah, it's clear from digging into these sources that there's no simple narrative here, no easy fixes for these complex trends and how we relate to each other.
But there does seem to be a consistent call, maybe underneath it all, for awareness. And perhaps most importantly, for intentionality.
Intentionality.
So, given the documented trends towards potential disconnection and the sort of double-edged sword nature of our digital tools, the sources kind of leave us, and you listening, with a final thought to mull over. What is one small intentional step you could take this week to try and truly see someone, to maybe apply that generous listening or ask one dupper question, whether that's in your physical world or even in your digital interactions?